My name is Samuel, and I serve as a forensic technician at a morgue located in the center of New York. I have been in this profession for a decade, witnessing events that most people can only envision in their worst nightmares. However, what transpired in 2014 caused me to reevaluate everything: my logic, my sanity, and even my choice to continue in this field. I had never experienced fear in my own skin until that night, when I realized there are phenomena that defy explanation and perhaps should remain undiscovered. It was a rainy evening, the type of heavy, persistent rain that seems to wash away any evidence of life from the streets. Late that night, I received a body which wasn't entirely out of the ordinary. It was a man without any identification, discovered in an alley downtown. The most disturbing aspect was that, despite having been the victim of a severe beating, his face was an unidentifiable mass of bruised flesh and torn skin. His head was the only area of his body where there were any injuries or defensive wounds, as if someone had let all of their anger out on him without giving him a chance to defend himself. Since the morgue was empty that night and my coworker Jones had called in sick, I made the decision to begin the autopsy right away. I didn't mind working alone because there was something almost calming about the mechanical routine of my job. Open, analyze, record, close. Close, but something felt off the minute I opened the plastic bag containing the body that night. It smelled strange, not like the typical scent of a fresh corpse, but more acidic, as if the body had begun to decompose at an unusually fast rate. I started dictating the case details after turning on my recorder. As I spoke, I had the strange feeling that I wasn't alone in the room. It was ridiculous, of course, that the morgue was totally locked down and that I had personally turned on the building security system when I got there. But even so, every movement I made felt like something was following me. The man was about 40 years old, unidentified, and had multiple head and facial injuries without any indication of defense wounds. The way it lay there made me feel as though I was watching, even though his eyes were closed as they should be and his head tilted slightly in an odd direction toward me. It's not like corpses can truly express anything. Disregarding the pain, I started cleaning the skin in order to inspect the wounds. I halted and turned to face the dry sound emanating from the rear of the room containing the refrigerated body lockers, hoping it was simply a temperature change causing the metal to contract. I took a deep breath and forced myself to concentrate. Perhaps I was simply too exhausted to finish right away. The atmosphere changed as soon as I picked up the scalpel to make the first cut. It became denser and heavier, and my fingers shook. As I leaned down to get it back, the scalpel fell out of my hand and clattered to the ground. My throat tightened with breath. The corpse's hands, which had been limp at his side only moments before, were now crossed over his chest. I froze. No one else was in the room and I hadn't moved him. I tried to tell myself that perhaps I hadn't noticed that I had put his arms in that position before, but I knew deep down that I had done it, so I forced myself to go ahead and finish the first incision. The silence was broken just as I opened the abdominal cavity by a muffled groan. I jerked upright and spun toward the door, thinking someone had entered, but the room was empty when I noticed something. Not only were the corpse's eyes open, but they were staring at me. My mind frantically tried to come up with a logical explanation. Perhaps the eyelids hadn't been completely closed and had opened due to involuntary post-mortem muscle relaxation. That I tried to resume my work, but I couldn't get rid of the overwhelming feeling that something invisible was in the room with me watching. Then, the security alarm I had set off when I arrived was suddenly off. Someone or something had disabled it. I hurried back to the autopsy room, determined to finish quickly and leave, but as soon as I stepped inside, a chill went through me. The corpse was no longer on the table. The plastic bag had arrived empty on the floor, and my mind was left empty, unable to comprehend what I was seeing. I looked around the room in an attempt to convince myself that I had somehow messed up and that the body had just moved, but that didn't make sense. Bodies don't simply vanish. And then I noticed it in the room's darkest corner. The body was standing straight, its head cocked at an odd angle, and its once pale, lifeless skin had turned reddish, as though blood had somehow returned to it. I wanted to run, but my legs felt paralyzed. Instead, my body took an involuntary step back, knocking over a tray of surgical tools. The loud crash didn't startle the figure watching me from the shadows. I shut my eyes tight, wishing that when I opened them, everything would be back to normal, that the body would return to the table, and that this would all be an illusion caused by exhaustion. However, when I opened my eyes, it was closer. I could make out its face, or what remained of it. Its lips twisted into something that was neither a smile nor a grimace, but something far worse, something mocking and inhuman. I stumbled backward, blindly reaching for the door, and somehow managed to pull it open and escape into the hallway, not stopping until I reached the main exit. As I raced down the stairs, I heard a heavy thud from the autopsy room, as if something large had crashed to the floor, but I didn't dare to go back. I burst outside into the rain, gasping for breath, letting the downpour drench my clothes. Then I saw it through the morgue's glass doors. The autopsy table was back to its original position, the corpse lying quietly with its eyes shut as if nothing had ever happened. I checked the security video, but the footage from that night was corrupted. The electronic logs revealed no irregularities. When I reported the incident to my superiors, they assumed I had made an error due to fatigue. I didn't argue. Who would take me seriously? Since then, I have kept working at the morgue, but I never stay alone at night. I refuse to ever go through anything like that again. Yet sometimes when I try to sleep, I get the unsettling feeling that someone is standing at the foot of my bed, watching me with those same eyes that should have never opened again. My name is Sarah, and I've been working in a morgue in Chicago for more than 10 years. It's a profession that few prefer and many dread. Most nights glide by in complete silence, accompanied solely by the steady hum of fluorescent lights. However, some nights alter everything you believe about the world, leaving you with questions that remain unanswered. This is the account of one such night. It was 2009, a typical Friday, or at least that's how it seemed at the start of my shift. The air felt thick and muggy, making everything seem heavier. I could sense that a storm was approaching by the smell of wet earth filtering through the window cracks. Around 10 p.m., I got a call informing me that a new body was on its way. The ambulance arrived a few minutes later, its tires screeching against the asphalt, and two paramedics brought out a stretcher draped with a white sheet. At that moment, the atmosphere appeared to grow more frigid. It was the body of a young woman, no older than 30, based on the initial report that indicated she had died in a car accident. As I wheeled her into the autopsy room, I felt as though the eyes of a religious painting on the wall were following me, as if judging something I didn't understand. The right side of her face was severely disfigured, and the dried blood created a disturbing contrast against her pale skin. But something about her didn't fit something I couldn't quite define. The storm outside broke just as I started going over her case. The room was briefly illuminated by file lightning, and the rain continued to beat relentlessly against the roof. Miss Hart was her name, and she lived alone in a downtown apartment. And based on the records, she had no close relatives, so there was no more death to add to the statistics. However, there was something unsettling about her case that I couldn't ignore, so I went ahead with the examination. Her injuries were consistent with the report. A severe blow to the skull, multiple rib fractures, but when I started cleaning her face for the forensic photos, I noticed something odd. Her skin had intricate symbols that looked like they were etched by someone using a fine needle. The medical report didn't mention them, and they appeared too precise to be unintentional scars. I attempted to ignore it and carry on with my work, but as I completed the reports, a sound drew me in even more. My heart was racing as I turned to face the autopsy table. I realized that Hart's body was exactly where I had left it, motionless beneath the sheet. I slowly got to my feet, feeling foolish for even considering checking again. But my curiosity overcame me. I walked over to the table and pulled back the sheet. And although her eyes were still closed and her body was still lifeless, I took a deep breath and told myself that it was all in my head. However, as I turned away, I noticed that her hand was rigid and stiff, and that it had moved slightly as if it was reaching for something. I had seen post-mortem twitches before, and it wasn't uncommon for corpses to have muscle spasms, but what happened next stunned me. From across the room, my gaze stayed locked on her. I had witnessed bodies move before, as it was part of my job, but this was different. This was deliberate, as if Letitia was trying to communicate something. I remained frozen, unable to turn away or even move. Then the crying started again, louder this time, and it was emanating directly from her. The lights flickered violently as the storm outside intensified, creating an atmosphere in the room that felt thick, heavy, and suffocating. While Letitia's body stayed motionless, a profound sense that something was deeply wrong permeated every corner of the space. Gathering all the bravery I had left, I moved closer. There were no hints of life, but her expression had shifted. Her once serene face now bore a twisted grimace, resembling either a smirk or an expression of torment. I couldn't quite tell which. I attempted to pray, something that usually helped when everything felt too overwhelming, but the words eluded me. My throat constricted, and fear paralyzed my entire body. Then I noticed another detail. The symbols etched on her skin were darkening, as if being carved more deeply with each second. In a bid to regain control of the situation, I resolved to review her case file again. Perhaps I had overlooked something that could clarify the situation. I examined every line in detail, and then I discovered it in the part that listed her personal effects. It noted that Letitia had been wearing a small amulet at the time of her death, yet there was no amulet among the items that were returned with her body. I went through her clothing and the plastic evidence bag containing her belongings, but found nothing. Then I recalled something the paramedics had mentioned casually when they brought her in. The accident was peculiar, as if the car had been propelled by something rather than crashing on its own. Suddenly, all the fragments fell into place in a horrifying manner. Letitia was not merely an ordinary victim. Something else played a role in her death, something that hadn't been disclosed in the reports, and whatever it was remained in this place. The storm outside reached its peak, and abruptly, the lights went out entirely, plunging me into utter darkness. The crying had ceased, replaced by something worse. An overwhelming, suffocating pressure in the atmosphere. as if something invisible had filled the room. I understood that I was not alone. Though I couldn't see it, I was certain it was present. When the lights flickered back on, Letitia remained on the table, but something had changed. Her face no longer bore that eerie smirk. Now it looked tranquil and serene, and the symbols on her skin had disappeared, and I gazed at her for what felt like an eternity, attempting to comprehend the events that had just unfolded. I'm uncertain whether it was simply my mind attempting to make sense of what occurred, or if I had genuinely witnessed something beyond comprehension. However, I am aware that after that night, something within me shifted. I never included what transpired in my report. No one would have believed me. But since that night, every time I enter the morgue and sense the change in the air, I remember Letitia. I contemplate the mysteries we cannot elucidate, the tales concealed within places like this. Each time I find myself alone with a corpse, I whisper a silent prayer, not only for them but also for myself, because there are certain things that ought to remain hidden, yet sometimes they manage to resurface. My name is Susan, and I have been working in a morgue in New Orleans for the last decade. Throughout the years, I've realized that death can sometimes feel as routine as a regular office job, but there are moments when it challenges everything you think you know. I don't typically believe in superstitions, but an incident from 2017 is something I can't shake off. I don't even want to forget it. It was a humid night in August, with the air feeling stifling. A storm had caused power flickers, making the morgue feel heavier than usual. My shift began as always, with endless paperwork and routine body verifications. Then, a new body arrived, but this one came with more caution than details. The paramedics left in a hurry, almost as if they were eager to get away from it. In all my years working here, I had never experienced anything like it. The body belonged to a man named Leonard Pierce, who had been the leader of a small local cult I had heard rumors about but never took seriously. According to the report, he died from cardiac arrest, yet the forensic examiner noted that his heart showed no signs of failure. That was peculiar, but what really grabbed my attention was a prominent warning at the bottom of his file: "Do not embalm." There was no medical rationale given, no additional instructions, just that one caution. I had never encountered anything like it before. Leonard had been rumored to be involved in dark rituals, but I focused on science rather than folklore. The body was in impeccable condition, too impeccable as he had been deceased for over 24 hours, yet there was no rigidity in his muscles and no indication of decay. His skin was pale but not the usual gray tint most bodies develop. It was as if he were merely sleeping, as though he might awaken at any moment. I set aside my unease and got ready for my task. There was no rational reason to avoid embalming him since cult beliefs shouldn't interfere with my work. I arranged my instruments and commenced the procedure, which was when complications began to arise. Initially, it was subtle. The body felt peculiar, almost as if it were resisting. Not in a physical sense, but the skin had an unusual texture and the emanating fluids didn't drain correctly. Yet, I pressed on, convincing myself it was just another cadaver, or at least that's what I told myself. Then, as midnight struck, the storm outside escalated, causing the windows to rattle and thunder to crash so forcefully that I flinched. Suddenly, I heard a noise behind me. I turned, expecting to find that I had accidentally knocked something over, but everything remained in its designated spot except for one item. A storage compartment door was ajar. I could have sworn I had closed it earlier. I approached and shut it tightly, but when I turned back to the autopsy table, I froze. Gregory's arms were positioned differently. I hadn't shifted him. I tried to convince myself that perhaps I had placed them like that and simply hadn't noticed, but somewhere deep down, I understood that wasn't accurate. The lights flickered again, and then every metal tool on my table crashed to the floor. There was no reason for that occurrence, as the table was steady. My hand trembled as I bent down to retrieve them. I was about to push myself to continue my task, but then I noticed Gregory's face. His eyes, which had been closed upon arrival, were now slightly ajar, just enough for me to glimpse the shine of his pupils beneath his lids. It was incomprehensible. I stepped back from the body. The atmosphere in the room felt dense, almost stifling. The lights flickered violently, and the thunder outside was overwhelming. I had witnessed post-mortem muscle contractions before, but this was not the same. I reached out to grasp his arm, seeking to reassure myself that his body remained lifeless, but as soon as my fingers touched his skin, my stomach churned that he wasn't chilly. His body was not rigid. Rather, his muscles felt taut, as if something still lingered within him. That's when the doors to the autopsy room swung open abruptly. I flinched, my heart racing. There was no breeze and no one else in the building, yet the doors moved by themselves. The shadows in the room shifted with each lightning flash. Then I glanced back at the body and my blood ran cold. Gregory's head had turned toward me, his lips slightly parted, and for a brief moment, it seemed as though he was grinning. That was enough. I bolted, abandoning everything behind. I couldn't care less about my job. I had no interest in seeking explanations. All I wanted was to escape. I never shared what occurred that night. No one would have believed me. However, since that evening, every time a thunderstorm strikes, I recall Gregory's eyes and the sensation that something from beyond death was observing me. Certain things ought to remain hidden, but sometimes death isn't powerful enough to keep them buried. I have spent most of my life working in morgues, a job that terrifies most people as it involves facing death up close each day. But for me, it became routine. The deceased had already confronted their worst experiences, experiencing no pain or fear, just the stark, mechanical process of examination. However, in 1998, something occurred in a small-town morgue in Nebraska that has stayed with me ever since. Even now, I question whether it was real or simply a trick of our fatigued minds, but I know it was genuine because what followed me after that night still haunts me. That evening began like any other. I arrived at the morgue around 8 p.m., an old, small facility, one of those government buildings that seem to have been lost to time. The fluorescent lights flickered from time to time, and the air remained perpetually cold, even during the summer months. My supervisor had already completed his shift, leaving me in charge of the establishment, though I wasn't entirely by myself. Adam, a newer assistant, was with me who had a tendency to take things lightly, a trait I thought was unsuitable for this line of work. For the first hour, everything was straightforward. We were setting up instruments for the following day when we received a call. An ambulance was en route with the body of a young girl who had been in a car accident. A tragic but not unusual occurrence. Yet, something in the officer's voice instilled a sense of dread in me. He mentioned the accident had taken place on a remote road outside of town, and when they found her, she was by herself, but the tire marks on the pavement indicated that someone else had been present. Nobody knew who she was. She had no identification, no personal items, Nothing that could reveal her identity when the ambulance arrived. She was placed on a gurney and covered with a sheet when Adam and I went to pick up the body. We moved her to the autopsy room to get ready for the routine intake. But as soon as we opened her face, I felt a chill that wasn't related to the cold moor air. Her eyes, despite the fact that her body was pale and bruised, were wide open and gray. Not a soft, cloudy gray, but a deep, unnatural shade that made it seem like they weren't from this world. Her eyes were dead, but she was looking at us. She shook off the feeling and carried on with the routine, which was unusual for Adam. We positioned the body on the metal examination table and began the intake procedure. That's when something small yet disturbing occurred. A faint noise, reminiscent of something light dropping to the floor, caught our attention. Both Adam and I turned towards the sound. A scalpel, which had been securely placed on the tray just moments earlier, was now lying several feet away on the ground. Initially, I dismissed it, thinking we must have inadvertently knocked it over, but then it happened again. This time, an entire tray of instruments slid off the counter and crashed to the floor, and neither of us had touched it. The lights flickered once, then twice, followed by a giggle, a high-pitched, playful sound reminiscent of a child's laughter. That noise left me frozen in place. I glanced at Adam, who had also heard it. His grip on the clipboard was tight, his knuckles turning pale. We both directed our gaze towards the closed door, where it seemed the giggle had originated. I chose not to voice my thoughts, preferring to ignore it. I forced myself to continue working, but my hands felt clumsy, as if something was actively trying to hinder my focus. A few minutes later, as I was examining the girl's body, the lights went out completely, leaving us in complete darkness. The only light I could find was a faint glow from a street lamp outside the window. I cursed and went to the light switch, assuming it was just a power outage, but as I stumbled and looked down, I noticed several medical trays scattered on the floor that didn't make sense because they had been securely placed on the counter. The lights flickered back on, and I followed Adam's terrified expression, and my stomach dropped. Her cheek bruises appeared less severe, as if her skin were healing. Trying to convince myself that it was just my imagination, I leaned in closer, but as I got closer, I noticed something even worse. Her eyes had moved. They were still open, but now they were staring at me. The air was filled with a humming sound that felt like a silent, vibrating force pressing against my skull. Adam remained motionless, gazing at the girl as though he were seeing something otherworldly. That's when I realized we were not alone. I attempted to shut the girl's eyelids again. It was an instinctive response, a frantic effort to bring back normalcy. But as soon as my fingers touched her skin, it felt like her gaze pierced through my hand, as if she could still perceive me even with her eyes closed. I stumbled backward, knocking over more tools. I was frozen in place. I don't know how long we stood there, but eventually, I took hold of Adam's arm and dragged him toward the exit. We left the autopsy room without glancing back. The following morning, we returned with our supervisor and tried to recount what had occurred, but he dismissed us, of course. However, when we entered the room, everything appeared normal. The trays were arranged neatly, the lights functioned properly, and the girl's body looked entirely ordinary. Yet her eyes, despite her being officially declared dead, conveyed a sense that she was still aware, as if she had witnessed our presence, as if she was still anticipating something. After that night, I never dared to look into a corpse's eyes again. Some nights, regardless of how much time goes by, you can't shake off those memories. No matter how fervently you attempt to bury them in the depths of your mind, they always resurface. I've known since I was a student that being a forensic pathologist could expose me to frightening situations. I got ready for it. After I started practicing, I thought nothing could surprise me because I had read a ton of manuals, reviewed countless photographs and testimonies of violent deaths, and obsessively studied every part of human anatomy. However, there are times when events occur that go beyond what we think we know, and the line separating the incomprehensible from reality blurs, leaving a bitter taste. I recall the day my certainty crumbled. I was working in a small Kentucky town where everyone knew each other by their first and last names, and the majority of forensic cases were ordinary traffic accidents. It was an inner trembling you never fully recover from. Natural deaths among the elderly and the odd fight that ended tragically were nothing like what I was about to experience. 6 months prior, I had been assigned to the local hospital's morgue, where we had a small but reliable staff and a small space. We were effective despite having only a few steel examination tables, a small refrigeration unit, and a makeshift lab, and I never felt cold. After passing through those doors, a body that was unlike any I had ever seen was wheeled that morning amid a dense, deafening silence. It belonged to a girl who was no older than 11. She had a very pale complexion and a remarkably enlarged abdomen that was so tense that it felt like something inside might burst at any time. The physician was unable to identify the cause of death right away. I tried to steady myself as I looked at her for the first time, but something in his eyes contained fear. As I read through his notes, I felt a lump form in my throat. He wrote that the girl had been found in a vacant lot on the outskirts of town with no obvious external signs of violence, and that her clothes were stained with a reddish-brown fluid that appeared to have been seeping for hours. Her facial expression was also described as being frozen in a state of extreme pain. Life had felt so normal that it seemed impossible to find such a nightmare in a place so remote. But reality was catching up to me so quickly that Silent Morgue felt like a confessional revealing the darkest facets of human horror. I couldn't help but think of my own daughters or the neighborhood kids who ran around the park on weekends that very morning while I was having coffee. I followed all the procedures to prepare the body for the autopsy, putting on my gloves, adjusting my face mask, and turning on the overhead lights that shone on the steel table. I closely inspected the swelling and found small marks on the skin that appeared to be internal scratches. Even though there were no obvious external abrasions or cuts, with my scalpel in hand and my fingers trembling a little, the unusual rigidity surrounding the navel area was particularly noticeable. When I started the incision, I was overcome by a suffocating smell that was much worse than the typical cadaveric smell. It was an acrid, almost sickly sweet stench that made my stomach turn. I cautiously opened the cavity in the hopes of discovering an internal hemorrhage or peritonitis, which could account for the unusual bloating. However, what I saw caused me to gasp and take a step back in shock, because among her twisted intestines was something strange and unthinkable. A rag doll covered in dark fluids had a misshapen face, eyes that had once been just buttons fused with clotted blood, and what might have been a dress that was now reduced to shreds. My skin crawled at the doll's expression, which gave the impression that its cloth features were twisted rather than just stitched. A shiver of fear ran up my spine. Its mouth opened in a silent scream that felt uncomfortably human. When I finally caught my breath, I leaned in for another look because the air around me felt heavy, as if it were charged with something evil. For a brief moment, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, either that overwhelming smell or a hallucination brought on by exhaustion. There was no logical way that an object of that size could wind up there without any external tears or injuries. So I carefully started separating the tissues to remove the doll. With each movement, my horror increased. The doll wasn't just put there. It appeared tangled among the intestinal loops as if it had been absorbed or swallowed by the child's body. After several agonizing minutes, I finally freed the doll and placed it aside on the table. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest and the air in the room feeling stifling. My assistant, who had stayed a few paces away, gave a sharp gasp upon seeing the doll and covered their mouth and closed their eyes in an attempt to process the sight. The intestines seemed to coil around the doll's limbs like fingers gripping it, making it an agonizing task both technically and psychologically. I still had fluid-covered gloved hands that were shaking so badly that the room was too quiet. Under normal circumstances, I would have carried out the autopsy to determine the official cause of death. But the image of that blood-soaked doll with its ripped face staring at me with a distorted warning that I couldn't interpret upon closer examination of the abdominal cavity left my mind blank. It seemed as though the doll had always been a part of her body, an intruder with no trace of entry for a few seconds. I did not find any signs of violence or trauma that might explain the doll's presence, nor were there any wounds that would indicate a forced insertion or any indication of any covert surgery or strange ritual. Despite my panic attack, I made myself keep my professional composure. I started narrating my initial observations, my voice trembling as I presented an unusual textile object without any visible cuts. But every word sounded so ridiculous, as though I were dreaming of something unreal. I continued checking the rest of her body for wounds, bruises, and indications of abuse or poisoning. Nothing clarified the circumstances. Everything came to a standstill, and my gaze went back to the doll that was waiting to be examined. Her lungs were swollen, as if she had experienced abrupt respiratory failure or something similar to drowning from the inside. But there was no fluid in them, and her heart displayed a slight enlargement that made no sense for a child of her age. I tried to concentrate on the paperwork as if creating some semblance of normalcy could anchor me that night because I couldn't sleep at all. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the girl's bloated belly with the doll stuck in her intestines, and its twisted rag face locked in a silent scream. Its vacant gaze was unbearable, as if it might blink at any moment. I felt queasy and knelt in front of the toilet, perspiring in fear. As soon as I composed myself, more terrifying visions came to mind. I saw the girl at my bedside, staring at me through hollow eye sockets and holding that awful doll to her chest. I attempted to come up with logical explanations, such as the possibility that the doll had been placed inside her after she passed away, that it was the product of a sinister cult employing methods I couldn't have imagined, or that the girl had a rare illness that led her to consume doll fragments. However, there was no evidence to support any of these theories. Over the course of the following few days, I kept examining the corpse, collecting samples and examining the doll to look for fibers or other evidence. Wherever I looked, the doll's cloth was partially disintegrated and soaked in bodily fluids. My mind was racing, trying to find an explanation that would never come. However, from the empty lot where her body had been found, I did not find any foreign hairs, fingerprints, or even mud or dust. The doll was missing an arm and a portion of its face, as if it had been corroded by a chemical for which there was no obvious reason. Local officials started everyone eyed each other suspiciously, waiting for a bigger scandal to emerge. Deep down, I knew this wasn't the result of normal human violence. I'd seen violence before, but rather something else that broke the rules of what we consider reality. They whispered among themselves that maybe I was afraid to reveal evidence of a possible cult activity, or that I couldn't confront the truth. Soon after, I started having recurrent nightmares. In other dreams, I was powerless to stop the girl's bloody trail as she wandered the hospital hallways with the doll stuck in her stomach. A cold dread crept through me as if the place had become shrouded in darkness. At times, I heard footsteps around me, faint creaks, or the subtle clang of metal instruments when no one else was around. I was the one lying on the autopsy table when she opened my abdomen to place that horrifying doll inside, stitching me up with a black thread I couldn't tear. Mornings found me drenched in sweat, my palms bearing crescent marks from my own nails. One afternoon, while looking at tissue samples of the girl under a microscope, my assistant confided that a rumor was circulating around town that people believed the body was cursed and that the doll was a dark amulet seeking its next host. I noticed that my coworkers seemed tense too, though none of them admitted to feeling the same. We all pretended to be professional, as if filing data mattered more than facing the sinister gloom that had descended upon us. Although I wasn't superstitious, the case was entering mob territory. It was as if no one knew who the girl really was, or if they did, they ran away from the truth. Eventually, we identified her from local records that matched her physical description. But the situation became more confusing because she had been reported missing 3 years prior, had a name, and a listed address. Even the local pastor refused to bless the body, saying he felt an overwhelming dread in its presence and that he couldn't bring himself to pray near forces unknown. However, when we got to that, we discovered nothing but the burned remains of a house. Neighbors refused to talk, and some elderly residents whispered stories meant to frighten disobedient children or hinted at past tragedies. It felt like the entire town had a secret that I was unaware of, one that they kept to themselves out of sheer terror. As my investigation progressed, my nights became more agonizing, and every time I closed my eyes, I had to revisit the autopsy. With a silent, eternal scream, the doll's deformed face was exposed by the scalpel slicing the skin. I initially attributed the creaking sounds I was hearing in my own house at night to the wind or footsteps in the hallway or the refrigerator door opening on its own. My keys began to appear in odd locations. The front door was frequently left open in the morning, and I was paranoid. I thought that something had escaped from the autopsy, and occasionally I thought I saw the girl's silhouette in the shadowed areas of my living room. Her stomach was swollen, and a hideous doll was sticking through her rib cage. I was so distraught that I thought about quitting. The idea of laying another body on the morgue table, turning on those lights, and finding something even more horrifying made me sick. But I told myself that I couldn't run because I needed answers, even though my hands were shaking all the time. While going through the file one afternoon, I noticed something unsettling. The girl's clothes didn't match the ones she had on the day she was reported missing by her family. She was discovered wearing a white dress that was blood-stained, and the floral embroidery on the dress was odd as well. I kept the dress as proof and sent it to a specialized textile lab in a nearby city for additional examination. It was my first time leaving that oppressive place since the nightmare started, but the short trip out of town felt refreshing. Upon explaining the origin of the dress, the lab technicians appeared uncomfortable, but they acknowledged that the embroidered flowers did not resemble any known commercial pattern and that the threads were dyed using an ancient organic substance, possibly animal blood combined with vegetable dyes. I was more perplexed than ever when I got back to town because every hint led to a dead end. Apart from the possibility of septic shock, the autopsy still did not provide a conclusive cause of death. However, there was no evidence that the girl had swallowed the doll or that someone had forced it down her throat. Rather, it seemed as though the doll had just materialized inside her. My annoyance took over. The town's mood became more hostile in subtle ways as I stopped going to see friends and bar, and instead spent my days buried in files and personal notes until dark circles formed under my eyes. Some people blamed me for drawing dark forces by delving too deeply into a cursed case, while others claimed to see strange shadows prowling around the morgue at night and hear a child's cry near the hospital when dusk fell. The most superstitious people thought the girl's spirit wandered in agony because her secrets had been discovered, and every night I sat in my well-lit house, unable to sleep, listening to the wood creak and pondering whether she was pursuing me. When I finally felt overwhelmed one evening, I went back to the morgue, closed the doors, and stepped into the dim glow of the emergency lights. I stood in front of the steel table where I conducted the autopsy and carefully examined the doll, which was primarily made of old cloth filled with what appeared to be hair and lumps of malformed clay where its button eyes had been. There were also shards of glass attached by some odd thread that seemed to be made from plant fibers. The discovery that it contained tiny bones, possibly from small animals, made my stomach turn. The atmosphere seemed to change at that point, and I felt a sudden chill run down the back of my neck. I also thought I heard a faint moan, like a lament in the distance, and I stood frozen, holding that poor doll with such trembling that I almost dropped it. I was unable to move in that sickening stillness, despite my mind screaming for me to run, drop the case, and leave that damned place. I believed that a faint, continuous pulse, like some hidden life throbbing beneath the rag exterior, was coming from inside the doll. I don't know how long I stood there, wanting to scream, but my throat was closed. After being paralyzed by fear, I finally succeeded in pushing the doll back into the bag that night. I refused to leave my small office, afraid that I might find the doll waiting in my bed. I locked myself inside and turned on all the lights, and I fell asleep at my desk. In my dream, I saw a girl rocking in a chair, holding the doll and stroking it in a disturbingly maternal gesture. The girl looked up, her eyes fixed on me, and she mumbled something incomprehensible in a voice that seemed to echo from a deep, abysmal void. I woke up in alarm at the first light of the day, gathering the last of my courage and retrieving the evidence bag, my hands shaking, fearing what I might find inside. That I end the last-ditch effort with the intention of burning the municipal trash to the ground. I drove far out to a remote location. As I watched the flames devour that disgusting rag, I felt a chilly wave of relief. Even now, I'm not sure if it was right or wrong to destroy the thick smoke curling into the sky, but in my desperation, it seemed like the only choice. Following that, the investigation was formally closed. Since no family members came forward to claim the child's remains, I cited a lack of evidence to establish the precise cause of death. The case was filed away, much like so many other tragedies that become part of local legend. My life, however, was never the same. Every time I enter a dark room, I half expect to see those glass eyes staring back. Every strange noise at night reminds me of the beating heart I swear I felt in that doll. Despite the fact that I no longer work in that morgue, I continue to be haunted by nightmares of that girl smiling with the doll stitched into her belly, or by the echo of shrill laughter in the dark corners of my home. Mostly, one question remains unanswered. How did that object come to be there? And spoke with colleagues who research unexplained phenomena, but nobody has been able to provide me with a satisfactory explanation. I've accepted that I will always be afraid because I firmly believe that there are unknowable places in this world where innocent lives are lost, turning reality into a nightmare. Some part of me knows I should destroy the notes and photos I still keep locked up in a cabinet at my new practice, away from prying eyes, but I can't help but hold on. Perhaps it's the irrational hope that one day I'll piece the puzzle together, or perhaps there's a deeper darkness that ties me to that event in ways I can't fully understand on sleepless nights. I open the cabinet and look at those autopsy photos again, gazing at that blood-soaked doll, remembering the foul smell, and feeling horrified by its twisted face. My life has been centered around denying the existence of ghosts, while sensing them in every flicker of darkness. I've discovered that some stories leave an irrevocable mark, and no matter how hard I try, I can never truly leave that morgue behind or the specter of that little girl. I witnessed a horror that transcends all boundaries, and even though my sanity survived, my soul remains trapped in the shadows of that steel table. I carry this mental prison within me with no way to escape it. When people ask me why I left that town so quickly, I explain that I can't bear to tell the truth because I know that no one would believe me unless they had stood there with a scalpel slicing open an innocent-seeming child and discovered something that is beyond human comprehension. As a result, I live with hazy memories and a persistent terror that haunts me in my nightmares, where I see that blood-stained doll every time I try to fall asleep, and I imagine it still exists somewhere in the world, even if it has been reduced to ashes that have been scattered into something even more evil. That I close my eyes and think back to that crucial instant. The first cut, the foul stench, and the sight of an unfathomable horror. I will always remember its distorted face and mouth opening in a soundless scream that has become a part of me and shakes me to my very core whenever I'm by myself. I'm positive that neither time nor distance, nor my frantic attempts to return things to normal, will be able to erase what I witnessed. That doll became my own shadow the instant I laid eyes on it, serving as a somber reminder that some truths should stay hidden. Rat and homeless men. What if I told you that occasionally, there are bodies in the morgue that employees prefer to avoid handling alone? They tend to steer clear of these cases, not wanting to get too close. You might be curious as to why, and that's exactly what we're about to explore. To protect the identity of the person who shared this experience, names will be changed and the location won't be revealed. I want to start by recounting an incident from my workplace, specifically in the morgue. One evening, Mr. Ray approached me, showering me with over-the-top compliments, a clear indication that he had a favor to ask. "My dear friend, it's wonderful to see you. How are you today? Ready to tackle another night of work? No one compares to you here. Even the deceased must grin when they see you." That was his typical way of greeting me when I arrived for my shift. Evening, Ray. Enough with the flattery. If anyone frightens the dead, it's you. They certainly don't smile. They weep. I hope you didn't make their situation worse with your chatter today, considering they're already gone, I replied, keeping the exchange lighthearted. He chuckled but continued with his excessive compliments as I signed in for the night. I knew him well, and his praise always came with an underlying request. To cut to the chase, I said, "All right, Ray, what do you need this time?" He draped an arm over my shoulders and, as we walked down the hallway, lowered his voice to avoid prying ears. "Today is my ex-wife's birthday. We divorced years ago, but we're still tied together because of the kids. They called me asking me to join them for dinner tonight. I wish I could invite you too, but, well, you're on shift. So, here's the deal. A little over an hour ago, a body arrived, and honestly, I couldn't even begin to examine it. Just seeing it, I knew it was going to be a complicated case. Dr. Ray was watching me closely, anticipating my response. You know the type I'm referring to, those unique cases that demand time, patience, and skill. Since I know you enjoy a challenge, I thought it would be unfair not to offer this opportunity to you. Don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to exploit your generosity, but I can't afford to be late tonight. You understand my situation with my ex-wife and the kids. If I arrive late, it'll be a nightmare." Ray took a deep breath and made his request. Could I handle the autopsy for him, starting with that particular body, which was already on the table? And of course, he wanted me to keep it a secret. When he referred to a special body, he meant one that no one wanted to handle, cases needing extra attention and skill. I couldn't tell if he was genuinely avoiding this tough case or just trying to leave work early. Everyone here knew Brooks well, especially about his personal life and his tendency to spend money on certain women on weekends. So, I had my suspicions about his motives, but in the end, it didn't matter. I was okay with helping him, as long as no one noticed he was gone and he returned the favor later. When I entered the morgue and saw the body on the table, everything clicked. No wonder he didn't want to work on it. It was clear instantly, an elderly homeless man in a pitiful state. The body was filthy, with tangled, unkempt hair and a long, neglected beard. Nearby, his clothes were just as dirty and reeked equally. I apologize if any of these details are too upsetting, but they are essential to comprehending the scene. Injuries cover his entire body, including bite wounds from small animals that appeared to have been feeding on him. His eyes and eyelids were gone, and his mouth was slightly open, revealing the absence of his lower lip. His nose was also missing, and some of his fingers were missing. The swelling showed that his decomposition was already well advanced, and everything suggested that it had taken a long time for him to be discovered. When I approached the desk to see if Ray had at least begun the report, I saw that there was only one note indicating that rats had likely fed on him while he was still alive, most likely while he was unconscious from alcohol intoxication. To put it another way, Cole claimed that the man had been intoxicated when he was attacked. After reading that, I took a deep breath, went to the bathroom, turned on the faucet, and splashed some water on my face. However, this wasn't a normal task preparation. Rather, it was a response to the numbness I experienced as I visualized that horrifying scene. A few drops trickled down my chin before I was able to gather myself. I had years of experience in the morgue, but standing in front of that body made me feel extremely uneasy, so I stole myself and started the autopsy. I had just made the initial cut to the chest. My first instinct was to find something to save the small rat that was struggling against the water flow inside the sink. I quickly turned and saw a broom leaning against the corner of the room and ran back to help the animal. But when I looked at the sink again, nothing was there. I searched the entire bathroom, checking every corner, but there was nothing. I froze for a moment when I heard the sound of running water, the tap, and the sound of flowing water echoed through the room. I had left the tap slightly open. I turned off the tap and went back to the morgue, completely uneasy. There were corpses all around me, and there was a rotting homeless man lying in front of me. But my thoughts were focused on finding an animal that had been there seconds before but had just vanished. I was still holding the broom when I heard the tap turn on again, and this time the water was flowing more slowly, as if someone were turning the knob inch by inch. I moved forward cautiously, each step weighed down by hesitation, not knowing what I would discover. However, one thing was for sure: the rat was not present. What I did see, though, made me freeze. The sink was full, the water was not draining, and worst of all, it was red. I dropped the broom right away and attempted to back away, but my legs gave out. When I fell to the ground, I noticed something even more unsettling. The tap was rotating on its own. The water stream slowed until it came to a complete stop, and as the red liquid swirled in the sink, it started to disappear down the drain as though it had never been there. I fought to stand again, my hands shaking as I forced myself to do so. My breathing was labored. I gasped for breath as I stumbled out of the bathroom, my heart thumping so hard that it felt like it was going to explode. In the hallway, I braced myself against the wall and put my hands on my knees in an attempt to steady my breathing. No matter how long I stood there, I remained motionless until my heartbeat slowed and my thoughts became clear once more. When I eventually regained control, I forced myself to think logically because there had to be a logical explanation. Perhaps it was the dim lighting, or perhaps my tired mind was playing tricks on me. Fortunately, no one saw me like that. Convinced that I needed to see the sink again to confirm to myself that what I had seen was only a hallucination, I went back inside, and sure enough, everything appeared normal when I returned. There was no sign of water, no red liquid, no rat, just the indigent corpse waiting for me on the autopsy table. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and clung to something bigger. I made the sign of the cross and muttered a silent prayer asking for the deceased's peace and clarity of mind. After that, I made myself to continue for a while. I focused on my work and went through the standard autopsy procedures while nothing out of the ordinary occurred. But then it happened again. As I handled the internal organs, I noticed a strange texture and something that didn't belong. I kept probing and examining, and when I realized what I was looking at, my stomach turned. I discovered that there were remnants of rats all over the digestive tract, some of which were stuck in the throat. The more I looked, the more I discovered, and then, out of the corner of my eye, something moved. My eyes automatically went to the corpse's mouth, or what was left of it. There was a slight but real movement, and I stared at it. No, it couldn't be, but it was inside the deceased's partially open mouth. A rat, a living rat, and my heart rate shot through the roof. I had never seen a rodent in this mortuary before, so why now, why with this body? If it was a coincidence, it was too much of one. So I reached forward, ready to remove the creature from the cadaver's mouth. But as soon as my fingers approached, the rat scampered backward, deep into the corpse's throat, disappearing inside him. I dropped everything, including the scalpel and forceps, and ran through the hospital hallways, my head spinning and my breath coming in short gasps. I needed help, someone who would listen, and someone who wouldn't think I was crazy. I stormed into the office of a coworker, one of the few people I trusted, and as soon as he saw my face, his expression changed. He didn't say anything, but the look in my eyes unnerved him for a long time. He just listened, and when I was done, I pleaded with him to accompany me to the morgue because I need you to see it. Required verification. My colleague frowned at me, his expression unreadable, and then cautiously asked if I wanted to stay with him. I hesitated, then shook my head. No, I need to finish this myself. He insisted that I stop for the night and go home to rest. He told me it was obvious I wasn't well. I thanked him for his concern, but I refused to leave. I needed an explanation, and he agreed. However, when we arrived, everything was normal. The body was exactly as I had left it, chest open, untouched, and showed no signs of anything new, bites or rodents. He sighed, gave me one last look, and left, leaving me alone once more. I had to finish this before the night was over. As I finished the autopsy, I told myself that the worst was over and that nothing more would happen. For a while, I was correct. Nothing out of the ordinary happened. The room was quiet that night, and I felt at ease for the first time. I chose to take a short break before finishing everything, and I sat down at my desk and looked at the corpse that had made this the worst night of my career. My mind drifted to my report, to my shift, to everything. I heard a low, raspy sound, but I knew it was coming from the floor when I leaned my head back and let out a deep breath. I looked down and saw that my entire body was frozen there, moving casually between my feet. It was a rat, not just any rat, the same one I had seen in the sink. It moved unhurriedly and fearlessly, as if this was its domain and not mine. At one point, it stopped, lifted its head, rose onto its hind legs, and looked directly at me. Its tiny nose twitched quickly. My first instinct was to kick it away and stomp it out, but before I could do so, a metallic clang reverberated through the room, the autopsy table creaking. My eyes darted upward, and then I saw it. The corpse was sitting upright, facing me, its head slowly tilting to one side as if studying me. But that was impossible because it had no eyes, only two hollow, swollen sockets that were dark and bottomless. I wanted to run and scream, but my body would not cooperate, and the final image I remember was his jaw simply peel off its face and fall to the floor as it continued to stare at me. Good evening. My name is Emma, and I have spent many years working in the funeral industry. Throughout my career, I've encountered countless experiences, but some still send shivers down my spine. I want to share a recent story that has left me searching for answers. My work has always been connected to the funeral business, and I have served in various morgues over the years, gaining knowledge and experiences. Some positive and others quite unsettling. Yet, no matter how much I learn, there are still moments that catch me off guard. Currently, I'm employed in a state close to the Midwest. While I'm comfortable sharing my name, I'd rather not disclose my exact location since the events I'm about to describe are still fresh. At the funeral home where I work as an embalmer, I collaborate closely with a colleague named Mr. Lee. We'll call him that, as he's unaware I'm sharing this story. He oversees the embalming department and the morgue itself. We've been working together for 2 years. On that day, when I arrived for my usual shift, he greeted me with an unusual warning. We have a complicated case ahead. When you hear that, your mind races with all sorts of possibilities. Despite that, I pushed forward, understanding that this was his way of preparing me for what lay ahead. Perhaps it was the body of a child, which is always emotionally taxing, or someone in particularly poor condition. As I entered the morgue, I set my belongings aside and walked to the covered body that awaited us. From its size, I could tell it was an adult. The corpse was draped with a white sheet, and I arranged my tools while greeting Lee. He informed me that we needed to begin the procedure immediately. "We've got a tough one today. We don't have much time, and it won't be easy. Let me show you why." As I approached the gurney, Lee pulled back the sheet, revealing the reality of our situation. The man before us bore the marks of premature aging. Deep scars and wrinkles made him appear much older than he actually was. I won't go into unnecessary detail, but it's essential to mention this to help you understand the complexity of the task ahead. His eyes remained open, but even though he had a thick mustache and a dense beard, his features were unrecognizable. Large parts of his face, including his nose and cheeks, were missing, and it was obvious that the lower half of his mouth was severely damaged. I hope this description helps you understand how serious the situation was. Regardless of my level of experience in this field, this man unnerved me in a way that I couldn't explain. Yes, his condition was among the worst I've ever worked with, but there was something else about him that made me feel extremely uneasy. Nervously, Lee began, "Let's get started." The case involved a 35-year-old male. Witnesses reported that he stepped into the street without checking for traffic and was struck by a car. Despite his injuries, he managed to reach the hospital but, unfortunately, succumbed a few hours later. Now, as I processed his words, I examined the man on the table, trying to grasp the situation. Yes, it was a challenging case, but was it really so uncommon? The problem is, Lee continued, typically, when a body is this badly damaged, families choose a closed casket funeral. But this family insists on an open casket viewing. As you can see, that creates a significant challenge for us. We need to render him presentable. He had warned me earlier that the family was affluent and had high expectations, willing to pay generously but demanding perfection. We were short on time, but we had to make it work. Lee spoke with the demeanor of someone experienced in handling sensitive cases. Those of us in this field understand the family's desire to say farewell and to see their loved one last time, as if they were merely sleeping. However, for us, the technical and emotional hurdles were immense. Regardless of our reservations, the family's decision had already been made. Lee gave me another call. "Let's get started." I was preparing the materials while he arranged everything. I kept my eyes on the man at the table, and something about him unnerved me, but I ignored it and got to work. It would take more work to prepare the body and apply restorative makeup to soften the damage this time, but luckily I wasn't working alone. I concentrated on the details that needed to be hidden because the body had already been cleaned, so there were no obvious blood traces. But I was uneasy about his bare mouth. Above all, an unsettling feeling overcame me because it was so open that I didn't even need to move anything to see what was inside. This man had remained conscious for some time after the accident, so the pain he endured must have been unimaginable. I tried to calm myself by reminding myself that even after years of working in this field, some cases still affected me, but this time something different was triggered by the closeness to this particular body. I had always felt sadness for a deceased person and often wondered about their last moments, the pain they endured, and the struggle for life that they ultimately lost. Despite the severity of his injuries, his mustache and beard would help conceal some of the damage, so I followed my usual procedure before starting work, which is to say a few words to the deceased, pray silently, apologize for the intrusion, and affirm that we are only there to help them move on in peace. With that in mind, we made our plan while working, and then, out of the blue, Lee asked this guy, "Do you feel off?" His question caught me off guard that I assumed that I was the only one experiencing that. I had already experienced more anxiety than usual, and hearing him say it aloud only made me more aware that something wasn't right. However, I decided to ignore it, thinking that perhaps it was simply due to how he ended up following the accident and how he passed away. Lee nodded as though he was trying to persuade himself that it was true, but I knew deep down that response didn't satisfy me at all. Shortly after, tried to align the man's jaw, but he abruptly jerked back as though he had been electrocuted. I looked toward the dead man's mouth to see what had happened, but nothing seemed unusual. Then I turned back to Lee and saw something unusual. He looked scared. I scowled, worried. "What's wrong? Are you okay?" He shook his head and tried to brush it off, saying, "It's nothing, everything's fine." But his tone wasn't convincing. He moved closer again, tried to align his jaw again, and flinched back as if something had shocked him. "I need a break," he muttered. "I don't know why, but I'm getting nervous." That caught me off guard. His reaction didn't make sense. There was nothing there, but something had made him recoil. Perhaps I was overreacting, but I had to understand, so I stepped forward and tried to do what he couldn't. I put one hand on the upper part of his mouth and the other on the lower part, trying to align the jaw. I had never seen him lose his composure in the middle of a job without another word. He walked to the sink, took off his gloves, and washed his hands before going to the restroom. I then understood what had frightened him over the years. I was well aware of the natural stiffness that occurs in a corpse and the obvious difference between a living and a dead one because I had worked on many bodies and had always focused on restorative makeup. But I also knew how to help with embalming when needed. At first, there was the usual resistance to movement, but then everything changed. It was as if the body itself was trying to open its mouth on its own, resisting my pressure. Dead bodies can have involuntary spasms or reflexes. My response was more severe than Lee's, and I closed it as though something inside was resisting. With a sharp gasp, I withdrew my hands. Lee, who was still in the restroom, heard my panic and rushed back into the room. Seeing my pale face and the struggle I had to speak, he demanded to know what was wrong. "It moved on its own," I whispered. We had already crossed the threshold of expecting any natural post-mortem reactions. This wasn't just some random muscle reflex. This was something beyond science. Lee quickly grasped what I had tried to explain and approached me cautiously, attempting to calm me down. "This happens sometimes," he said, trying to sound reassuring, but I could tell he didn't believe his own words. If it were truly common, he wouldn't have seemed so unsettled in the first place. I chose not to argue, and after a moment we both decided to pray. I had read that some souls struggle to move on and that prayers might ease their transition. I felt this was one of those instances. When we resumed our work, Lee managed to close the man's mouth without any further difficulty, but the unsettling feeling lingered. As he finished securing the jaw, I began examining the structure of the man's cheeks to plan for reconstructing them for the viewing when something even more disturbing occurred. The dead man's eyes opened. It was as if time had stopped, and they glistened as if he were about to cry. I know how impossible that sounds, but that's exactly what I witnessed, and Lee noticed it as well. He reached out to close the man's eyelids, but as soon as his fingers brushed against the man's face, tears began to spill down his cheeks. At that moment, something inside me shattered. Lee let out a heavy sigh. "You know what? Let's leave him be for a bit." I didn't argue. "There was something about this man," Lee added. "It feels like something is preventing him from moving on." His words resonated with me. Strange as it was, the feeling shifted from fear to sadness. Instead of stepping back, I stood beside the body, examining him closely. His hands were rugged and marked with deep calluses, a testament to a life of hard work. They reminded me of my husband, who had spent years laboring in construction, his hands toughened by the effort. Without thinking, I reached for the dead man's hand as a gesture of respect and camaraderie. His fingers were cold and rigid, yet the touch reaffirmed what I had sensed. He was a man familiar with struggle. I whispered a few soft words to him, assuring him that we were here to help him move on. But when I tried to release his hand, something incredible happened. I felt him grip mine. My breath hitched in my throat, and a chill spread through my body. I gently tried to pull away, but his fingers remained tightly wrapped around mine, a grip I couldn't ignore. A shiver coursed down my spine, and instinctively, I raised my gaze to his face. His eyes were opened wider than before, not just open, but fixed on me. The expression I saw was beyond description. I was overwhelmed with a deep and instinctive fear, as if I had witnessed something I was never meant to see. In a sudden panic, I yanked my hand away and stumbled back, rushing out of the room. Lee, alerted by my distress, appeared almost immediately. "What happened?" he asked. Trembling and struggling to find my words, I recounted everything to him. He listened quietly, and instead of returning to the room right away, we lingered in the hallway, trying to make sense of the experience. Eventually, Lee broke the silence, glancing at the man's records. "His name was Ben," he said, noting he came from a poor background. As he read further, his demeanor darkened. "There's nothing here that clarifies this," he muttered. "Unless the family was involved in something they shouldn't have been. Sometimes people interfere with matters beyond their understanding." He paused, then added, "However, I have another theory." I looked at him intently, waiting for more. "This man had advanced diabetes," Lee explained. "Even if he had survived the accident, he only had a few months left, maybe weeks. The doctors had already informed his family that there was no hope." He hesitated before continuing with his thought. "I can't prove it, but I've heard stories like this before. Perhaps they made a decision to let him go." His words struck me harder than I anticipated. When we finally went back into the room, I noticed the body had shifted slightly. The hand that had once gripped mine now hung off the side of the gurney. His eyes remained open but were now vacant, staring lifelessly up at the ceiling. After the unsettling events, the rest of our tasks proceeded without issue, and everything seemed to return to normal as if the previous incident had never occurred. When I left the memorial home that night, I felt a sense of completion. The family was scheduled to arrive early the next morning to view their loved one. Before I departed, I approached the deceased one last time. I gazed at his face, trying to look past the horror of what had transpired, and softly murmured my gratitude for the chance to carry out our work. Then I headed home. What transpired next remains inexplicable to me. I pulled into my driveway and entered my home, anticipating an ordinary night, but upon stepping inside, I spotted my partner in the living room. His demeanor was off. He was staring at me with an expression I had never encountered before. He was unblinking, barely turning his head as I walked in, and most unsettlingly, his skin was unnaturally pale, more so than I had ever seen on a living person. My heart raced. Something must have gone terribly wrong. I asked if he was all right, but his answer sent chills down my spine. I pressed him for clarity, asking again if he was okay, my urgency increasing. His voice was deliberate and almost hesitant as he recounted, "About 20 minutes before you got home, I was just here watching TV, waiting for you." I recalled our earlier text exchange in which he requested I pick up a few items on my way home. But then his expression shifted. "You sent me a message that said you were on your way back," he said. And then someone knocked on the door. A wave of dread washed over me. I knew it couldn't have been him, since he had a key and we lived on the second floor. Nobody ever knocked on our door at that hour. "I went to check," he continued, his voice trailing off. The tension in my stomach tightened. "When I looked through the peephole," he said slowly, "I nearly lost my breath." He turned to me, his face still pale. "It was him," he whispered. I felt my legs grow weak. "The man you were working on today?" I stammered. He nodded, confirming my worst fear. He was standing right outside the door. I shook my head in disbelief, unable to accept it. "That's impossible," I insisted. "I swear to you," he said. It was him. The same face, the same hair, everything. A wave of nausea rolled over me. At first, he thought someone in the building might need assistance. "But something about it didn't feel right," he added. I struggled to breathe as he recounted how he stood there. Not knocking, not moving, just waiting. "I panicked," he admitted. "But I thought maybe he needed help, so I backed away from the door and unlocked it." My chest tightened with fear as he continued. "But when I opened it, there was no one there. An overwhelming sense of dread enveloped me. "Nothing but silence," he said. A cold shiver ran down my spine as we sat in silence for what felt like an eternity. Finally, he asked, "Who was that man, Emma?" I found myself at a loss for words. He had never seen the body I worked on that day, yet somehow he recognized him. It was strange how that man had found his way to our home. I tried to rationalize it. Perhaps my husband was overly tired, or it was just a trick of the light. No matter how I tried to dismiss it, deep down I understood the reality. It wasn't a hallucination or a mistake. The man I had cared for, the one whose hand had held mine, whose jaw had resisted closing, and whose eyes had filled with tears, had come to find me. But what was his purpose? Did he just want to say goodbye? Or was it something deeper? To this day, I don't have the answers. What I do know is that after that night, we never saw him again. In our home, in our dreams, or anywhere else. It was as if he had finally found his peace and moved on. The lost soul. Since it is unquestionable that morgues contain strange occurrences, I have been a forensic expert for years. During that time, I have seen innumerable situations inside morgues, and it is not unusual for many of the patients who come to our facility to die suddenly and violently. My name is Sophie. Although I have a strong scientific background, I have always felt that people who leave so suddenly find it difficult to move on. I find it impossible to disregard some experiences that lead me to believe there is one particular experience that has stuck with me throughout the years beyond our comprehension, is the night I worked alone in the morgue at around 2 a.m. with just the security guard on duty. When the 18-year-old woman's body arrived, I took all the required information and started the autopsy as soon as the paramedics departed. She had been the victim of a hit and run a few hours prior. I won't go into specifics, but her condition had a profound impact on me. After finishing the process, I went to ask the security guard if any family members had come looking for her. He told me that no one had contacted anyone yet, so I took a moment to go to the bathroom, where I heard his voice speaking to someone in the distance. I accelerated my pace, thinking that the young woman's family had come to dry my hands, and I made my way to the waiting area, only to find him alone. He hesitated for a moment before answering, and it was a young woman who said she was lost and needed help getting home. She seemed confused, but I couldn't leave my post. She thanked me and left after I told her where she could catch a cab. I thought it was odd, but I didn't think much about it. I went back to work, and the rest of the night passed normally until the young woman's body unexpectedly fell from the autopsy table without any explanation. The sound of the impact hitting the floor chilled me because I was the only person in the room, and the position she was in made it impossible for her to have fallen on her own because I couldn't have lifted the corpse myself. When I asked the security guard for assistance, he agreed and accompanied me back to the room. But as soon as he saw the young woman's body, his face turned pale and he stood there frozen, staring at her, wondering what was wrong. I asked, sensing the tension in the air, and his voice wavered. "Do you mean that's the girl who came asking for help earlier?" I scowled. I'm absolutely sure even the tattoo on her right arm is the same. A chilling wave swept over me. We put the body back on the table and left the room, the silence between us speaking louder than words. The only thing we could say afterwards was that perhaps the poor soul hadn't realized what had happened to her yet. Maybe she just wanted to go home, but more than fear that night, I felt an immense sadness because she was so young, her life taken away in an instant, and based on what we had just witnessed, she didn't even know she was no longer among the living. It was the only thing I could manage to say as the air grew heavy. The lifeless body. Good morning. My name is Naveen, and today I want to recount an extraordinary experience from my life. For the last 10 years, I've worked as a forensic pathologist, handling bodies in various conditions of decay. I'm used to the solitude of morgues, and my typical working hours at night have made me comfortable with silence and darkness. However, when I began working at a particular morgue, something shifted. On that particular night, my colleague and I were on the night shift. At first, everything felt routine until we received the body of an elderly woman in a severely decomposed state. The team that collected her informed us that she had lived alone and that her passing went unnoticed until the unbearable smell emanated from her home reached the neighbors. We followed our standard procedures, performing the autopsy, documenting our observations, and finally placing her in the cold storage room. Everything went according to plan with no issues. After completing our tasks, my colleague and I decided to take a brief break. As we sipped our coffee and engaged in casual conversation, we began to sense something odd in the atmosphere. A heavy, invisible weight seemed to fill the space, making the air thick and uncomfortable. We exchanged uneasy glances, trying to dismiss the discomfort. Suddenly, the stillness of the night was interrupted by a distinct sound, the metallic creak of a door opening. We froze, listening as the echo spread through the empty hallways, pinpointing the sound to the cold storage room. "Did you hear that?" my colleague asked, his voice slightly shaking. "Yes, it sounded like it came from over there," I replied, not wasting any time as we walked towards the storage area. As I opened the hallway door, a chill ran down my spine. Only one of the refrigerated compartments was open, the one with the elderly woman inside. My partner glanced at me, clearly worried. "Are you sure you closed that door properly?" he asked. I nodded, assuring him that not only had I closed it, but I had also locked it with a padlock. That door shouldn't have been ajar. Something deep inside told me it was impossible. Yet in front of this sight, doubt started to creep in. Not wanting to amplify my partner's fear, especially since he was still new to working in a morgue, I tried to sound collected. I suggested that it might just be the result of the age of the storage unit. Maybe the latch had worn out. Without allowing panic to set in, we secured the chamber again and continued with our duties. Hours went by, and at one point, my partner left to use the restroom while I stayed behind organizing reports. Suddenly, the silence of the room was shattered by a muffled scream. "Naveen!" I rushed to the restroom. When I opened the door, I saw my colleague standing in front of the stalls, his eyes wide with terror and his breathing heavy. "What happened?" I asked, feeling a chill creep up my spine. With a shaky hand, he pointed to one of the mirrors. His voice was barely a whisper. "The old woman." Took a moment for me to fully grasp what he meant. "What?" I repeated. His lips hardly moved as he whispered. "I saw her in the mirror. She was right behind me, watching." At that moment, I was at a loss for words. I tried to reassure him that his mind was likely playing tricks due to the eerie events of the evening. After all, the elderly woman was dead. There was no logical explanation for her movement. But he wouldn't take his eyes off the mirror, his expression frozen in fear. He described every detail with haunting precision. The same face, the pale skin, the bruised eye, just as she had looked when she arrived. A knot formed in my stomach. He was genuinely shaken and believed what he had seen. I suggested he go home and rest, promising to take care of the rest of the shift. Perhaps what he really needed was a break from that suffocating environment. He reluctantly agreed, but before leaving, he grabbed my arm and implored me to be careful. He had no doubt about what he witnessed. Truthfully, I felt uneasy as well, but I forced myself to concentrate on my work. There were still more autopsies to complete. Time passed. About an hour later, while I was focused on an examination, the lights started flickering. First intermittently, then they went out completely. I quickly grabbed my phone, turned on the flashlight, and headed down the corridor towards the electrical panel. However, as I turned the corner, I froze in terror. The old woman was there, sitting motionless on one of the autopsy tables, staring straight at me. A chilling shock paralyzed me, and then, without moving her lips, she emitted a low, maniacal laugh that sent a cold shiver down my spine. Every instinct told me to run, and I did, not daring to look back. Just then, the lights flickered back on. I paused to catch my breath before turning around, but the corridor was empty. as if nothing had happened. I couldn't stay there alone any longer, so I called Dr. Kevin, the morgue supervisor, to tell him everything. He arrived quickly, and as I waited outside, trying to collect myself, he simply asked if I was okay. I nodded, but I was far from it. Dr. Kevin and I then entered the morgue together. We went together to check on the body of the elderly woman, and there she was, completely undisturbed, lying in the exact position we had left her. He took over for the rest of the night shift and sent me home. When I returned the next day, Dr. Kevin pulled me aside, his expression tense and his usual calm replaced by unease. Then he said something that chilled me to the bone. "You weren't wrong." Confused, I asked him to explain, and after a brief pause, he revealed that he had heard something unmistakable during the night. A woman's laughter. It was the same eerie, dragging laugh I had encountered, but he hadn't seen anything, just the sound echoing from the cold storage room. That was enough to unsettle him, so he decided to investigate further by speaking with the neighbors about the elderly woman, hoping to find a relative who could claim her body. What he learned was even more disturbing. Everyone in the area was afraid of her. They told him she had lived her entire life in solitude, with no family or friends. Children avoided passing her house because they believed she was always watching from her window. The horror deepened as some neighbors claimed she practiced dark magic, saying that at night, eerie wails could be heard coming from her home, accompanied by a foul smell seeping through the cracks. Sometimes, black smoke reportedly escaped from the windows. The rumors were endless, but one story particularly stood out. Years earlier, it was said that she had tried to abduct a 5-year-old girl, an incident witnessed by the child's older brother, who succeeded in pulling her sister away and running home. No adult dared to confront the elderly woman because everyone was too frightened, and those who had clashed with her in the past had mysteriously died in unexplained ways. Dr. Kevin shared that as he listened to these accounts, an unbearable weight settled over him, leaving him with an indescribable feeling. The bus of ghosts. Good evening. Since I'm currently waiting for the bus, I thought I'd take this opportunity to tell you about something that happened to me a few years ago. I haven't told anyone about it because it's still difficult for me to believe it actually happened, but I promise that everything I'm going to say is true. My morning routine has always been the same. I get up at 4:30 am.to work out, then leave the house just after 6 am.to catch the bus to work. I live in an apartment complex in a quiet neighborhood not too far from a famous lake in the city, and one morning, as usual, I woke up at 4 am. However, something felt off. I went through my usual routine, but there was one small detail. Before leaving, I put my phone in my pocket. Then, right before locking my door, I did my usual check of my wallet, money cards, keys, and phone. At the last minute, I hesitated, unsure if I had actually put my keys in my pocket. I reached down to check for my phone, but it wasn't there. I frowned and looked at the clock. It was 5:55 am, then went back inside to find it. After a brief search, I discovered my keys, but I had left my phone on the entryway table. I quickly grabbed it, put it in my pocket, and hurried out the door, which is when things started to get weird. I live on the 3rd floor of my building, which is slightly elevated, so every morning I feel a cool breeze when I step outside. But that morning the air was completely still. No wind, no movement, just a suffocating stillness. As I crossed the apartment complex toward the bus terminal, I noticed something strange. The dogs that usually roam the area were nowhere to be seen. Normally, they would bark at random or ignore people, but that morning, there was not a single bark or sign of them. I dismissed it and continued walking a few blocks later, and then I saw a woman up ahead who was dressed unusually elegantly for a typical weekday morning. She walked calmly, then turned a corner toward the terminal, and I kept my pace at a respectful distance. She seemed to sense my presence and abruptly stopped after a block or so. I assumed she was stepping aside to let me pass, but as I got closer, maybe only 3 feet away, I adjusted my path slightly to avoid getting too close, and that's when she turned her head and looked directly at me. "Good morning," I said politely, giving a small nod but avoiding direct eye contact. I have a habit of not making people uncomfortable when I'm walking alone in the morning. I tried to ignore it, thinking she was just startled by my presence. Perhaps it was because I'm about 6 feet tall, and she barely made it to 5 to 3. Perhaps the darkness of the early morning made her feel uneasy, but the way she was looking at me felt like something else. As I passed her, I could still feel her gaze burning into me. She didn't respond. Instead, she just stared. Her expression was intense, searching as if she was trying to understand something with a mix of shock and discomfort. Since I had left home earlier than usual, I didn't give it much thought, but then something unsettling happened as I approached the people in line. They turned and stared at me, and I suddenly slowed my pace, feeling my pulse. I forced myself to focus ahead and continued toward the terminal from a distance. The first bus line had a long queue, while the second line was almost empty. I hurried into the almost empty line waiting for the second bus, attempting to ignore the stares, but the feeling of being watched persisted. I heard people in the first line whispering to each other about something, and then an older woman turned around and leaned slightly toward me. She said, "Young man, you shouldn't be here," in a low voice, and I wasn't sure if I had heard her correctly. She didn't repeat herself. Instead, she just looked at me. Before I could ask again, her wrinkled face showed concern. An elderly woman turned back to me and said, "You mustn't get on that bus." As a small passenger van that resembles a smaller public bus pulled up, I hesitated as I watched the van fill with people. Then, a man who appeared to be in his 40s approached me, his face solemn. "Sir." His voice was firm as he said, "The bus is for people like you." I repeated, "You're not supposed to be here," confused, and he said, "Go home while you still can." There was something about the way he said it that unnerved me. I noticed that everyone was still staring at me when I unconsciously took a step back. Everyone in the line was observing me and anticipating my next move. Something wasn't right. The air felt heavy, so I did the only thing that came to mind: leave. The drive back seemed to take longer, and as I got closer to my apartment complex, I reached into my pocket to see what time it was. That's when I realized I had left my phone at home, and as I was ready to enter my building, I noticed the same woman standing at the same corner, still observing me. When I felt a little more at ease, I decided to check the time. I ran inside, locked the door, and tried to catch my breath after being shaken. I went straight to the kitchen, drank a glass of water, and sat down to try to process what had happened. I was certain that I had been out of the house for at least half an hour, but when I looked at the time, only 5 minutes had passed. My blood froze. How could that have been hesitant? When I went outside again, the cold morning air hit me as usual. The dogs were back barking and running through the complex. The woman was gone, the buses were running normally, The two lines were as they always were, and everything was exactly as it should have been. However, ever since that morning, I've wondered for a moment if I had crossed over or if I was somewhere else that I wasn't supposed to be. Many people think that the dead can visit the world of the living, but what if we, the living, were able to unintentionally enter their world? Perhaps the only difference is that ghosts are aware of their location, and we act as though we never saw them. The cult. Not too long ago, I had a memorable experience when I met my high school classmates in person. We had started school during the remote learning phase, and despite the distance, the three of us formed a close friendship, almost like we were childhood pals. Our conversations flowed naturally over texts and voice chats, and before long, we began playing an online game together. One of us, whom I'll refer to as Alex, had a tendency to stay online late into the night. At first, we didn't think much of it since it's typical for teenagers to game late, but when we finally transitioned to in-person classes and met face-to-face, the connection felt immediate, like we had known each other forever. During that first week of in-person classes, we decided to gather over the weekend to work on our assignments collectively. Although it wasn't required, we were looking forward to it. The plan was simple. Once class ended on Friday, we would head to Alex's house. His mom, who lived alone, wouldn't be home until late, so he was totally cool with us hanging out. "You guys can crash here if it gets too late," he suggested. It seemed like a fun idea since none of us liked being alone too much, and we welcomed the opportunity to spend time together. Alex's house was easy to find, located off a major street in the city. However, it was at the quiet end of the road, where traffic was sparse, making the neighborhood feel unusually still. I was familiar with the area from my childhood when I would accompany my dad to his job nearby on Saturdays when he got paid. Everything went according to plan. We divided our assignments efficiently and finished almost all of them by mid-afternoon. This left us free to play video games and time flew by. At one point, I glanced at the clock. It was already 9 p.m. We were sitting with our backs to the window, which had a clear view of the street outside. Occasionally, I would turn to glance at the boulevard and notice something unsettling. It seemed almost too empty, as if the entire neighborhood had chosen to avoid that stretch of road. Then suddenly, Alex's phone rang. He got up to answer, and it was one of his friends having a panic attack at home, alone with her little sister just a few blocks away. Without a second thought, Alex grabbed his bike and rode off into the night, leaving just me and Lily in his room. We sat there, uncertain about whether to continue playing. The atmosphere in the house felt different. I kept glancing at the boulevard, which remained eerily deserted, lit only by a solitary street lamp at the far end, casting a dim, isolated glow. Then we heard a strange noise. At first, we assumed someone was knocking at the front door, but when we checked, no one was there. That's when we realized the sound was coming from the backyard. We hesitated, straining to listen. There was a scraping noise, as if something was shifting among the old junk stored behind the house. I climbed onto an old washing machine near the back fence to see better. What I saw made my stomach drop. Two figures stood beyond the fence, hunched over near the back entrance of a building located below Alex's house, around 4 meters down in elevation. They were trying to force open a door. "Lily, get over here," I whispered urgently. She climbed up next to me, and her expression grew dark when she saw them. "What the hell are they doing?" she muttered. We weren't sure if they were burglars, maintenance workers, or something far more sinister. For a brief moment, we contemplated throwing something to scare them off. But then one of them turned and looked at us. That's when we noticed something even more disturbing. They were wearing long white robes, their hoods shrouding their heads and obscuring their faces. The only thing we could see were their eyes. They glowed with an unnatural brightness, like something that didn't belong in a human body. I barely had time to process this before they began climbing the hill that separated the buildings. The incline was steep, too steep to ascend quickly, but they moved as if it were nothing. They were coming straight for us. "Run!" Lily shouted, and we bolted through the house, sprinting toward the front door. Just as we were about to reach it, Alex's mother arrived. She had parked her car outside and started walking towards the front steps when she saw us burst out of the backyard. Panic etched across our faces. "What on earth is happening?" she demanded, panting. We tried to explain that someone was in the backyard, gasping that they were climbing up from behind the house. But before we could finish, she cut us off. "No one's back there," she insisted with an oddly firm voice. "And I don't want to hear about this again." We exchanged confused glances, a sense of unease washing over us. It was clear she knew about whatever was happening but refused to acknowledge it.